Uh, so, watching my own video, I guess, I didn't round off some points as well as I could have, and I didn't go back and make a general point as clearly as I might have, and I did misspeak twice. In just one instance, I said intuitive thinker when I meant to say intuitive feeler. From the context, it was that was not too hard to fathom. I'd also make notes of those points which I missed, and yeah. But in some sense, it was good to watch me do that, because then I could see which parts of the arguments, or when I was trying to lay out all the technical bits, what was actually missing, because often, the intricacies of one thing are a lot, and then you miss the general point to which that subsidiary issue was a part of. So yeah, I guess it bears sort of going into just the general character of the intuitive feeler as an individual, and I hope I get all these points right, because there are within the quadra there is quite a plethora of behavior, but I would say generally these people are they have a kind of propensity within themselves that they desire to be angry. Like they have this sort of burning agitation is a generally quite a good word. So it's either anger, or it's smug condescension, or it's a kind of self-deprivation. Because then already they've sublimated that into a kind of meta framework which they're sort of projecting onto their immediate environment. And these are things that people in the other quadra can also sort of do as well. But it's somewhat more hardwired in these people. Like for people in other quadra who sort of go through this, in a sense they're actually putting on a beta, a socionic beta, or intuitive feeler mask, because you see, especially with intuitive feelers, they create a kind of cultural vehicle for their persona, which is, so if they are in a friend circle or something like that, that energy kind of ends up pervading that cultural. When I say energy, I mean a sort of cultural. It becomes a sort of dimension to the structure of that group of people. And I was also going to make the point about intellectuals, because they can seem to make quite good intellectuals, because they are very good at armoring themselves with, like the most powerful ideological implements that they have, in their immediate, sort of. So they're quite good collators of practical things almost. I was actually thinking that the one job which they would probably be quite good at in general is being an agent, because that also then forces them to do what they do for others, but and then they sort of, their performance is reflected in the performance of the person who they're. I mean, I still wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want such a person as my agent, for instance. But because the sort of incentives are in line in such a way, you can sort of perhaps. Because, I imagine that they could still grieve their own clients for a kind of personal vendetta if they were happy enough. But if they were hungry enough, they would probably be very good agents. Or, yeah. So I guess the problem with them being intellectuals, for instance, is that they don't care about the conceptual things in themselves. They only care for how how it sort of can be used by them to sort of how they are situated within that field of concepts, you know. So it's very horrible, because if they've entrenched themselves, then you've basically got you know. So it wouldn't be obvious how intellectuals of this, you know, sort in particular fields, you know, it wouldn't be obvious where that kind of intellectual corruption at its most abstract is going to manifest, because it's in that weird sort of minutiae, you know. It's sort of you know, it's not easy to work out, because I mean, like, some of them, you know, will be very, very, you know, oh, you know, I'm always just working for the best. I'm working for the best of the field, or something like that, and it's not obvious where, you know, sort of they're holding the dogs at bay, you know, as they put them, you know. But that is the area in which they're sort of you know, cordoning off their, in a sense, their own prestige, because they can't handle the actual conceptual interpenetration of you know, they're just wanting to make a nice superficial divide so that they can have their domain to themselves, basically. And that's similar to what I'm about to describe further on about the general character of their relationship to their environment. But there's one more point about them being intellectuals. Yeah, but I would say that generally, I mean, I'm not saying everyone who does this would be an intuitive feeler, but I would say that this is quite a characteristic thing of the culture that they exude, which would be, you know, like when you get brilliant young people in academics, in academia, that are doing new work, and then they've got, you know, maybe they're doing their masters or something like that, they're doing some sort of post-grad thing, and then the person above them is sort of, you know, got their name down first on all the papers, you know, and almost trying to move the person whose original work it basically was, you know, like, toward the end of you know, like, I think famously that sort of happened to Feynman a bit. He was on the receiving end of it, but anyway, I mean, you know, that's a famous, you know, almost trope within academia. But yeah, so that's the sort of thing I guess I'm talking about. Well, that's an illustration. There's also something else I wanted to illustrate. But let me. So basically, the NF, which stands for intuitive feeler, the intuitive feeler mentality is abrasive. As a sort of core character feature, it is abrasive, and so what they long for, therefore, or what they require, is, especially if they aren't in a society that is literally at war with another society, because in a sense that would make them stable. So you can almost see that within the concept of Islam. So their intuitive feelers are quite happy, you know, because they're sort of in this constant struggle for world conquest, let's say. So there's always that other to project it onto, you know. But so their abrasiveness, you know, and then they can also police their own group internally to not succumbing to the influence of the other and giving up the pristine group identity or whatever, which is, that pristine group identity is always a sort of cookie cutter replication of the beta character itself. So that's also interesting, because as they police their in-group is policed to their standard of their personal psychology, basically. And this is the problem, is that so whenever they're policing their in-group for, you know, keeping up their mythological standards of, you know, like, what makes us different from them, or what makes them evil perpetrators and us pure, is based on them being able to project their own mentality as the standard. You know, so it does have that kind of assimilation sort of thing, you know. You can almost see that in the Agent Smith character in The Matrix, you know, how he's sort of, you know, like, he's so enthralled with the function that he performs for his culture, the policeman, right? That his whole culture should be assimilated in his image, basically, because he's keeping it safe. So it's sort of like everything should have to bear the same work of keeping it safe, you know. And so it's like, you know, there's no internal diversity. That's what it tends towards, at the very least. Especially when you start actually winning against the outgroup. If you sort of are perpetrating a successful genocide against the outgroup, and you have all the political power, what else do you have but to sort of internally assimilate, you know, which ends up infantilizing and dumbing it down and removing context and stopping people from thinking about things because they have to use the superficial measures. Okay, so intuitive feelers want to be abrasive, but therefore they have a kind of problem, because to be abrasive you need something to be abrasive against, and so you need something that exists, that you can tear it down, but that isn't going to be completely destroyed, so that you have something to tear down. So this is the problem. They have an intrinsic deficit within their own character, so they always are going to have an unstable relationship with their environment. This is the sort of the curse that they have. But you see, they sort of, okay, but part of this then is they need to create a safe political target, or a target that is socially safe for them to abuse. They need to, so they'll create a political vehicle for their abuse, to target their abrasion against. So they want a sort of a very superficially easy to target group that'll let them get their individual, you know, psychology, you know, active, that they've, you know, they can, because that's how they measure progress, is by sort of, you know, advancing themselves in relation to how well they're of utility to their group, which they can sort of only feel and know, you know, sort of emotionally, at the expense, you know, it's a sort of inverse, you know, is what. It's a negative way of extracting value. So it's like, as you're destroying something, as destructive as you are, that is how, that is the utility that you're sort of providing. And I think, you know, on some base level, you can't, I mean, like, they can't really believe that, you know. So it's a sort of, it's a useful fiction. So it's in the ideology of their own behavior. So it's like, they know that it's not so, but like, it's so natural, right? And yeah, so a lot of people can sympathize with them, even, I believe. You know, so I mean, even the sort of the KKK type people, I mean, a lot of the people in the hierarchies of those things, you know, it's kind of a choice for them to be there, but they're doing it because, you know, they've got intuitive feeling children or something like that. You know, they've got, you know, and it's like, what would they do? Because they can't exist in any other culture. They need a culture that's sort of baby-proofed for them, that is sort of allowing them to get their fix, basically. I was going to talk about, I don't think I'm going to talk about religion, but it is a kind of religious, it does kind of fill that, because I mean, like, for example, the whole thing of feminism, like the personal is the political. Sorry, let me see if I can make this more. So it's like, you know, saying the personal is the political is a very convenient shortcut to being able to do this stuff, in being able to set up the in-group and the out-group, and to set up the sort of the police. So that you can have that objective reliance on that sort of meta fact, and a kind of absolute categorization. So, because that really would be the easiest way to diffuse these things, is you just say, like, don't treat me like, so if someone says, oh, you've just microaggressed me or something like that, it was, okay, well, whatever issue that might be, how about you actually deal with it? But in the context of you not treating me like a political object, why don't you see how far you go in an actual continuing dialogue and individual exchange, where you're not bringing in this political group that I am, on the line, for that I'm sort of being kangaroo courted about, So, because that's at the point at which they sort of switch on their autism, and then they completely short-circuit the dynamism and also the potential and organic development in the exchange itself. So, let's just say you want to change gender relations between men and women. Okay, I'm just referring more to feminism than any of the other more complicated stuff. Like, if that's going to ever happen at all, it's going to happen on the ground one day, and it's not going to happen through political power and political power differential. It's going to happen with, with the example that I gave, even about that particular microtransaction, which was, I'm sure some people say that's not even a microtransaction, but like a microaggression, excuse me. You're cute for a fat girl, or something like that, or you're pretty cute for a fat girl. I think that was the microaggression that she said, or it was hot. It was hot. Or she even said she wasn't sure if it was hot or cute. I get. Well, my point is that it could have been. Instead of making it political and trying to sort of object to it on the level of politics, and trying to get other people to buy into a political system, you could have literally have just used your own personal power. You could have relied on your own personal power, but instead you relied on the power of as being a member of a group. And it's funny because I think that's even in their language, talking about personal power, but their ideology actually excludes them from ever having personal power. They only ever have personal power as much as they advance the interest of the whole ideological framework, and so they can only measure progress as much as the ideological framework has been bought into by the enemy, or has sort of made the enemy sort of pay homage to it, or allow it and be destabilized by it, which is also how they measure victory, which is that, we need to bring down the patriarchy. So it's literally, it's just a negative way of defining progress, is that just things must break down, and therefore it'll be better, because what is there is evil, basically. So it's just, they can only define evil. They haven't actually defined a positive, constructive good, only by the absence of this evil being mitigated is their progress. So there you see that's abrasiveness, which is, I should have also brought back again, is that sadistic edge. They need a socially safe target to apply their sadistic edge to, from the intuitive feeler. So they just want a nice political solution to being able to abuse people with that sadistic edge in their psyche. So if they were to actually rely on their personal power, they would actually, as an individual, not as a member of this victim group, that you could actually see what you have to work with quite easily. But then, it wouldn't look the same, because the answer wouldn't be, you shouldn't speak to me like that. It wouldn't be in that should. Like, what does that mean? Like, as in, you're the dictator of human life. You know, it's like, she could just say, well, what that means that you translate into in her worldview, I guess, you know. She could just say, well, that was autistic, or like, she could say, like, you know, does that mean that you spend your nights, you know, like, not interacting with other human beings, that you would be, you know, so blunt or something like that? And then maybe he would even turn it back and say, well, oh, well, I guess I just want you, okay, so, like, this is my envisaged imagination at work. So so they're two strangers. He walks up to her, he says, oh, you're pretty cute for a fat girl, which then I interjected, maybe that wasn't a microaggression. Maybe that was him, like, being a bit cheeky because he wanted to, you know, spark a bit of banter and see how you would play with it, and maybe how you would, you know, because maybe that's one way to cut the ice and see if you can, like, actually develop something from, you know, just two people meeting each other. You know, maybe there's a bit of privacy, you know, like, obviously it's not in the middle of a crowd where it's like, oh, she's being fat shamed in front of other people like a bully in the middle of school, because, you know, that's what you have to do to make the microaggression thing true. And she even said that she didn't think that he knew that he was being offensive. So she literally wanted to just educate him. That's literally, I'm just giving this reporter of this microaggression. So this isn't some sort of savage bully. She's just saying that, you know, this is the sort of socially, politically inept person who doesn't already slavishly belong to the rules of my cult, you know, like, that's sort of her complaint. That's my translation of her complaint. And I'm saying that, you know, like, basically that could have had a happy ending, because if she actually engaged with him on his level, she could have still won. She could have still said, you know, like, that was not cool. She could have said that was not cool, but not saying, I'm going to language police you, please make sure that you go along for the rest of your life knowing that you can't say this to people. Because, like, the mind doesn't fucking work like that. Like, literally, if, like, maybe intuitive feelers would record that in their mind, because that's the nice thing to have in their memory banks, because they can, like, they will be the active police force for that. They will be, you know, like PC Principal in South Park. Like, they're going to love that stuff, because every time they get to sort of use that as a trudgeon over somebody else, it, like, you know, they get their internal psychology. Oh yeah, there are also these two videos on YouTube which I found, which are really good to juxtapose, and I guess maybe I would cut them into this video if I did editing, but the one is called, and I almost hate to bring this stuff up, because I don't know how much thuggery I might get, but hopefully I'm unpopular enough that it'll never matter. But I think the one video is called Rich Piano Meets Jason Genova. Is it Jason Genova? And that sort of transpires into a fight. And both of these people, I believe, are intuitive feelers. The one guy is actually handicapped, but I don't discriminate. Like, I mean, he's intelligent enough. I believe that, you know, he's got a sense of social interaction, right? Like, he's got but that doesn't mean that what's happening to him is any better. You know, it's sort of, I'm just, you know, it's like two people with two people who have similar characters, but one has more cultural, social power and is also physically bigger or whatever, and the one sort of okay, I don't know if I should sort of describe it. So basically, this one guy, the guy who is handicapped, is a bodybuilder, and he's, you know, I guess, you know, he's natty or whatever, so he's not as big, or he's, you know, pretty decent still, and he's, you know, also much younger, so obviously he's not as strong. He's also not as big as this other guy, and I know he makes videos, and he called out this really big, you know, sort of completely professional kind of, you know, like, guy who is, like, really built, and then he met him in real life, and somebody else was recording it, and he knew that this guy had sort of called him out on YouTube or something like that. It's called Order 66. And so that, he wanted, so like he just sort of, in that moment, he felt like he was being abrasively, so this guy who's handicapped is going to sort of waltz up to him and just sort of, like be this nice guy and be like, and they were talking about it, because he was like, oh, I think you did this to me, and he's like, and then he denied it, and then he said, oh yeah, no, I guess I did actually, and then he was like, why did you do that? And he was like, oh, so it's like that itself even implicitly has a kind of sadistic edge to it, that sort of that playing it so passive, but yet having at its core an aggressive position, so that I find, these are two people, both intuitive feelers, that are sort of dueling even at that level. There was a kind of passive aggressiveness, but obviously everyone is going to sort of generally just side with the handicapped guy, that he was being overpowered by this other guy who was bigger, even though this guy who put himself into the situation and obviously has enough social, awareness to be aware of basically what he's doing. I mean, these people are not stupid. They're not morons. Like their IQs are. They have aspirations of social prestige. Especially as an intuitive feeler. So anyway, yeah, obviously, this is so politically incorrect talking about any of this, I guess, but this is life, I believe, and this is a wonderful visceral example. So the thing that is most obvious of what I'm talking about, right, that I wanted to juxtapose with some other videos, is that when they saw the big guy, he's like, okay, well, I would like to, let's just, get this over with then, or whatever, like let's just do slap boxing for 10 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever, just so it's like out of the system. And I guess he's doing that because he's literally just been slighted a second time by this guy sort of, just walking up to him and like, pretending to sort of rewrite history, which is, that's also a common intuitive feeling, tact. It's like, well, let's just remove, all the intricate details in history, and we'll just have like, like it is what I say it is, like it's as cool as I think it's cool, or whatever. And okay, that will probably offend most SJWs because they do really think that history is on their side. But it's like, you're talking about people that have taught you in post-colonial studies, and gender studies. So anyway. Because, I mean, anyone can create a victim narrative about how they're the most, exploited group. You go back far enough, and how was that ever resolved? Like how did that ever improve? And actually get a positive description of how things get better, and then focus on that, rather than focusing on this deconstructivist utopian bullshit. But which doesn't get you anywhere, okay, enough of a tangent. So the slapboxing, during the slapboxing, it looks especially bad because the big guy says, are you ready? Like he asks the question, are you ready? Like while he's doing it. He asks the question 5 times while he's slapboxing like 5 times. And now that looks particularly bad because ostensibly he's asking a question. He says, are you ready? But he is answering the question that he is supposedly asking for the other person, and he's not listening. He's not eliciting a response. He's not interested in the response. Are you ready? Or at least that's how it appears. I mean, perhaps he's sort of, the other guy is shaking his head, but he's shaking his head so reflexively, almost like he's hypnotized. Because he's hearing, are you ready, and he's responding to it, that it's almost even short-circuiting his own capability to be ready, because he's answering, are you ready, while actually, which is being asked to him 5 times. So he's like keeping up answering it on perhaps some subconscious level. He knows that there's that social cue to engage with, which is kind of short-circuiting his ability to perhaps be ready. So it's interesting that there's this element in intuitive feelers, and because I mean I do believe that is a pretty good reduction of it. That I don't even know if the guy was shaking his head to answer, because to me, I would just interpret that body language as him not giving a response to the question, "Are you ready?" That he was not responding to the question, "Are you ready?" at all. He was just, there was no particular "yes, I am ready," in any of, because there would be a kind of a more actuated composure to when you hear that happening. So what I'm basically saying is that and this happens ideologically when you see it in the SJWs, where they'll pose challenges, sort of that they will talk very quickly, because they're sort of trying to introduce that meta-objective reality to what is happening. To the individual exchange, they're trying to rely on this greater narrative, meta-narrative, which so everyone knows what's happening. So it's a cultural signal of what it means, So they're sort of within that political targeting mechanism that lets people get their sadistic edge off, So there's this semi-famous Jordan Peterson video where he's being sort of mobbed outside a lecture hall or something like that, or he's given a talk, and not going to get a human being wearing black and black lipstick. I'm pretty sure it was very dark makeup or whatever, looking. Okay, I can't say that. Was sort of issuing like 3 different questions in succession, which were basically insinuating that that Jordan Peterson was perpetrating an attack on trans people, and Jordan Peterson actually starts to engage this person who doesn't want to be engaged, but is ostensibly making a case by asking questions that cannot be answered, or that the Jordan Peterson is too afraid to answer. That's the sort of that's the sentiment that's being projected, that this person is trying to escape from the truth, that he's implicitly implying that Jordan Peterson is trying to escape from having to answer these questions, or that he can't contend with them. And because the answers are so damning. And so I just thought that there's a really good juxtaposition, because it's like there's that common thread where it's sort of you're posing a question which you supposedly are directing the question, but you are answering the question for the person that you're supposedly addressing. And that's where I see that facsimile happen, that there's a sort of internal facsimile of the other that becomes this kind of ideological puppet. And it really is just to facilitate that sort of the sadistic edge. And the vehicle that happens in becomes the sort of the excrement of culture and progress itself. This is why I would say pageantry exists in certain old institutions and churches, things that people don't understand anymore, and there's no connection, there's no education. I'm not a Catholic at all, but when you go to a Catholic church, does anyone actually explain to you the embroidery of certain offices, why they wear it, or something like that? Does it have any actual explanation or significance? That is not just, oh well, it's aesthetically pleasing and we've always done it. I wish I didn't use that example exactly, but you know, and so this is the problem. So there's always an impediment to applying, you know, like cultural evolution on the level of the individual exchange. Their ideology removes that capability completely. They just want gang warfare, basically, and they want their gang to win. So I mean, you know, that's essentially what you should do. Is you basically say, don't treat me like a political object. I mean, you don't have to say that in the exchange, or you know, like overtly, but essentially that is your position. Is, you know, like, how about you don't treat me like a political object, and I have a conversation with you about what it is that you expect from me, and, you know, how it is that comes about. You know. But, you know, obviously that's impossible for them to do because they don't have a positive structure of how to do it. You have to sing along with their chorus of how their deconstructivism, you know, operates, which is for a quality of outcome, and by applying a quality of outcome to whatever they see, which is obviously an incredibly abstract thing, which is impossible to do. Like, you can't apply a quality of outcome is not an actual measure. I mean, like, you can do it, but, you know, it is the definition, therefore, of discrimination. If you apply quality of outcome to a situation, you can't do that to people. You know, it's just incredibly demeaning. It also removes competency. It removes everything. It has a huge perverse incentive. That's the biggest problem. Is that it literally has the most perverse incentive that you can imagine to apply quality of outcome to a situation. I mean, it has a perverse incentive on the level of individual motivation and individual. So I'm just trying to think that. I mean, technically there are situations where it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. I'm just trying to think if I can classify those, but, you know, those. I mean, okay, well, this is a red herring to bring up, but, you know, so for example, if you're leaving money to your children, I mean, you don't necessarily have to do a calculation as to which is more deserving. I mean, I guess on some level, perhaps you do, you know, like perhaps you say, well, the one child, you know, has certain life conditions and experiences, and they're not capable of fending for themselves, so I'm going to favor them in the inheritance. Or if they both are adequately close enough that it doesn't really matter, or the one has more children than the other, you know, like, or if they're both reasonably the same and, you know, you just divide it completely evenly, you know, like, what does it, but, you know, that's within a sort of, in a closed system. Also, where you can sort of, it's your right to pick and choose whatever criteria you wish. But if you want to impose this umbrella filter on life itself, on, you know, sort of life energy in a kind of, in an aggregated way, and you're going to fiddle around with that, to create this kind of what's the word? Intermediate gatekeeper between one person and the next person. You know, so I mean, this is where the visions of that sort of evil totalitarian or socialist, or, you know, sort of state socialism that gets into everything, that gets into every part of culture. You know, a kind of both potentially a brave new world, but also, you know, like where you have to accept the culture. There was another thing when I was going through the jobs which an intuitive feeler should not be engaged in. I left out one that I especially thought to mention in the first place, which I didn't, which was that journalism. They should definitely not be in journalism. It's like, somewhat. So I mean, I said politics. I said dealing with children's minds, especially. If I added another one already, so but journalism as well, definitely. Yeah, so I mean, like, replacing the personal dynamic in an exchange is horrendous, because then you literally are removing any way in which you can actually have progress. The only way that you can define progress is by belonging to the in-group. And so this is why it is the blueprint of fascism. For it to succeed, it has to create a fascist culture and political structure. Which has been created, or it's attempting to grow in my country, and who knows how successful they really are. I mean, they said in August that they're probably going to do something, that white people must conduct themselves as visitors from, I think it was the 2nd of August onwards. So I guess we might quite soon get a taste of what they have planned. I mean, to tell you the truth, the ruling party, which is ruled by, at the moment, the president, which is a very sort of corrupt person, who's taking bribes and who is destroying the country just to secure his bribes, because within his own party there was resistance to him, taking everything for such a ride. Like, I have hope that the ruling party can clean itself, that it can sort of regenerate itself eventually. The problem is in the intermediary stage, although the ruling party at the moment right now has suddenly gone full on kind of fascist it's not I don't think it's going to, I don't know if I don't know if it's politically sustainable for the ruling party, but there is already a separate political party which was made from some of the people that were kicked out of the ruling party a few years ago, and they were kicked out basically because they were fascist, and they were in the youth league of the sort of group. And so they were very radical, and they just, and very corrupt as well. I mean, like, so even though the president of the youth league literally had a mansion, and and the taxman doesn't know how he got it. It's that sort of it's the same thing as the president, just on a smaller scale. So this is that these radicals have that kind of cronyism always circulating them. They're just like hotbeds of corruption, and the only extra utility that they promise their people is that we're going to destroy the enemy on your behalf. That's the sort of the deal's quite simple. Like, we'll destroy your racial enemy, but we get to steal everything and destroy society, but you'll feel better because everyone in your country will be the same color. That's the sort of pact that they make. And then even if you get into that pact, not only do they do that, but then they'll ramp up their cultural bullshit. Like, they'll just keep on constricting the culture, because you need something to apply the sadistic edge to. So you have to make the culture more and more insane, basically, and then it does become quite delusional. The hyperrealism that was experienced in Nazi Germany, which I don't think it's not psychologically sustainable. Even for that 20% of the intuitive feelers who are the true believers, it's not sustainable, because, as I said, you need something to actually tear down. And if you are the winners, there's nothing. You see, this is the thing: is that it is an unsustainable psychological disposition. Needs real energy to keep on extracting, what was I going to say about generally how cultures have sort of dealt with these people and cordoned them off, and that was going to get me into religion, or some discussion about some religions. Mainly I was going to focus on the religions that I don't really see as religions, that they are in fact political movements, but they label themselves as religions, and then they kind of have these intuitive feelers to thank for it, because they've sort of they've basically made peace with them, and they have given up too much for that peace with these intuitive feelers. But sorry, let me get back to that other point. I was just about to say, so it's funny because it gives a point where I think even the culture itself realizes that it doesn't want to go down this path. But the intuitive feelers are so empowered by the culture and by the ethos, and they have nothing left to do, basically, but to police their own in-group. So if they hear that people are sort of, dissenting, right, or if people are like, we don't, like, actually these Nazis are not cool people, everyone, like in the streets, they're marching and it's wonderful or whatever, but, they're just like, well, this feels a bit inauthentic and fake to me, or something like that. There's nothing for anyone else to do but to sort of report on you and have the brown coats come in, or the Gestapo or whatever, and sort of sort you out. So it turns in on itself, it becomes that sort of wolf tribe thing, and then those intuitive feelers, all they have to do is just have their sort of their antenna out, looking for dissent, basically, because that's all they do anyway. That's their basic disposition to begin with, and now they're sort of empowered by this political thing. So it's weird, but they are happier being the underdog. In a sense, that's what their mentality is. This is why you see, people forget that the Nazis saw themselves as the underdog. It's part of the sacred victim mantra. It's part of the sacred victim political mythology. Because although I say the word scapegoating, they don't see themselves as scapegoating. Obviously not. You can't think that you are scapegoating someone. You have to believe that you've found the problem and you're exterminating it, right? And then, the other point that I wanted to make, which is, because the sad thing is that a lot of these people in these post-colonial studies and these gender studies, a lot of them are even, because it just shows you how it goes in all types of people. You have Jewish intellectual who are at least ethnically Jewish academics, right? And they've gotten all the fanciest ideas, and they've sort of collated them. There's even the woman that was I don't know if she is Jewish ethnically. No, it doesn't matter too much, but it's a good example of the sort of the type of person. the person who was the legal interlocutor. I think she was a legal professor or something like that, who was debating Jordan Peterson and talking about academia, talking about knowledge itself and talking about biology and just saying all these outrageous things. But you see, this is at the core what they do, is they just sort of, they have this prestige and they have they just have this semblance of authority, I was going to point out two things. There was and I simultaneously forget both of them. I had some historical examples. What I was saying about that is that obviously it's about these people who are ethnically Jewish. I don't have any. I mean, I'm sort of at least a quarter ethnically Jewish. My point about the ethnically Jewish thing is that I know that themselves, a lot of them will find it very offensive that I will compare them to people like the KKK. Which, I don't see. It is unfortunate, I guess, on some level, that we're making that comparison. And I know that a lot of people might attack me that saying, oh, well, you're just being, how are you any different? You're creating this ideology around psychology or something like that. How do you distinguish it from what they're doing or something like that? It's interesting because I do think that question itself, actually, how about have some curiosity to go into something, to actually test it. I mean, actually sort of engage with it and measure it, rather than sort of a superficial sophistry around it. Because, I mean, at the end, I do think that question itself, I had it formulated better in my mind, but is that sort of challenge to what I'm saying is in fact, I'm not saying that the person who would ask such a question would be an intuitive feeler, but I'm saying that what they are essentially doing is representing that that strata of culture and wanting a defense for it in the same language and in the same sense. So it's like, no, you have to provide a very superficial measure where the purpose and the method is the same, so that I can distinguish superficially, what you're doing from what they're doing. Okay, well, when I was thinking through that, it seemed more pertinent, and I articulated it better in my head earlier. But it's interesting. And what I was going to say about the positive things, when I say positive, I mean a positive definition of progress, let's say, and of what we want, rather than defining what we want by how to destroy what we don't want, which is a vortex of sort of nihilism, hidden within this sort of sadistically edged ideological vehicle for toxic people. Yeah, and then I was also going to say that, the mainstream itself is much more subject to these intuitive feelers. They are forced to cater to them, basically, because they're also the most vocal and they have a lot of power within their sort of traditional. It's not even that they're traditional, because I mean the SJWs don't think of themselves as traditional, but within the reliance on their sort of presumed prejudices, like, I mean, I guess it's funny just how inverted their whole world is, because it's like they literally want to create a world where you can know how good someone's opinion is, or how to listen to them based on the color of their skin and what what biological sex they are and what their sexual orientation is. On that basis, you will put a spotlight onto people. Like, how destabilizing is that? Like, in terms of actually resolving problems, you're not going to listen to people based on what considering what it is that they are contributing. It is a superficial measure of the potency of what people have to contribute because of an underlying presumed equality of outcome which hasn't expressed itself, and as it starts expressing itself, the world will just get more and more beautiful. I mean, like, I guess it is difficult to see how that is nihilistic, because it's sort of, on some level, it just sounds so radically beautiful, or something like that. But, so, yeah, I mean, it's almost like a facsimile, but an absurd facsimile of romanticism. But, I mean, I would say, because personally, I don't see all of these problems starting when most people think that they started. It was the destruction of Russia that actually started all of this stuff. And I'm not talking about Leninism particularly. I mean, what was destroyed in Russian society, because their elites, although economically they were terrible and they were, engaged in feudal relations and all that, but culturally, the wealth that they had and the wealth that was destroyed, I mean, that was the engine of the West. The soul of the West died in the Russian Revolution. It's a sad but true fact, and we don't have enough people yet to get anywhere close to that. Because, I mean, like, really, the rate at which culture develops has to do with how much energy you can put into culture, which isn't a sort of, it's not like, well, if everyone gives an hour a week into it, we can develop something. No, it's like you need specialization. And the women were also incredibly astute. The women were just as learned as the men as they were developing this, as they were a part of it, as they were inventing romanticism. And they almost completed it. They almost got the doctrine right. They really did. They studied they studied the human in all of its sort of philosophical depth. A very good representation is if you just watch War and Peace, the miniseries. I think it's an HBO miniseries, 6-episode one. That gives you a glimmer of the height of culture, and at least as it was developed in the West, because I mean we've lost half of that at the very least, and what we lost, which was worse than that, was the engine that made that, because Western Europe only ever copied what was generated by Moscow, by Russia. Western Europe could never compete. Their aristocracies were just too small. They were just like, the closest semblance was Louis's, little apartment in Versailles, with trying to get his noblemen together. And I think there were just too many intuitive. You see, you can't just corral all the noblemen together. It doesn't work like that. In Russia, they still had freedom, but they had enough of them. They had thousands of princes and princesses, so they could they could move so freely. They weren't just sort of, okay, we'll get into an apartment together, So that's, so Louis, in a sense, was the proto modern. I mean, King Louis V, I think, in France. He was no. I don't even know if it was the fifth. There's a series about it now. When I say that, so like he sort of made a model of what our society degenerated into slightly, you know, so sort of, you know, being in an apartment building, so sort of, I mean, because they were essentially modern, they were taking drugs and they were having orgies and, you know, there was this sort of war in morality and things like that, but there was no real development, you know, it was sort of, it wasn't refining itself, and just as a sort of, I guess, just that implicit thing that was all happening under the roof of the king, you know, and just how it was sort of artificial in its sort of conception and in its, you know, sort of forcing the noblemen there. And then they were nobles as well. They weren't real royalty like the aristocracy. You see, that Russia was in a sense, it was politically superior because they didn't have a king, they had an emperor. And if you were noble, and a lot of those noblemen, when I say 1,000 princes and princesses, they were, a lot of those parents of those princes and princesses were as rich as the kings of Europe, you know, because, you know, when you were a king, you didn't just own the country, because, you know, you still had kind of feudal baron relations and things like that. But anyway, and I'm not standing up for class relations. I'm just saying it's like a fact, you know. This is just a fact of a kind of philosophical history, let's say. And, you know, obviously that is the plan. We need to get back there. We need to all be royals, let's say, you know, and we need to fix things. But I'm not going to get into Marxism, at least my brand of Marxism. But anyway, okay, well, okay. Hopefully I've contended with some of the things that I didn't do as well in the last video, but I'm sure, again, it doesn't really